Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. Our guest today is the Executive Director of the World Food Program, David Beasley. He joins us from South Carolina. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Mark.
So the World Food Program is helping lots of people around the world, and you recently warned the United Nations Security Council that unless we continue our operation, the health pandemic, the COVID pandemic, will soon be followed by a quote-unquote hunger pandemic of biblical proportion. Aren't you exaggerating?
Oh, gosh, Mark, I really wish I were. But here's the situation. In fact, before COVID hit the scene, I had been warning leaders, particularly in the European area, that we were facing in the year 2020 the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. And when you look at the Sahel deteriorated, Sudan, Yemen, Syria, Ethiopia, DRC, all the floods, the droughts, the conflicts and the wars, we were already facing a very bleak situation, and then desert locusts hit, and it's devastating in 4 or 5 countries as we speak. Then came COVID. In fact, 2 weeks ago, we just came out, when I was speaking to the United Nations Security Council, I had just produced the new numbers of the people around the world that were marching to the brink of starvation. I'm not talking about hungry people. There are 821 million people around the world today that go to bed chronically hungry. 135 additional million people are on the brink of starvation. Now, out of that 135 million, Mark, we at the World Food Program, we supported last year about 100 million people. Out of that 100 million, 30 million depend on us 100%. That's the only food they get. Now with COVID, our numbers are anticipating an additional 130 million people on top of the 135 million, bringing almost 250 million people will be marching towards starvation because of the economic deterioration from COVID, wars, conflicts. It is a perfect storm. I do wish I were exaggerating, but we are really looking at what could be famines of biblical proportions in multiple countries, and especially in Africa.
We're talking, according to your assessments, of about 36 countries. That's a lot.
Yes, in fact, right now, I would say 5 to 6, maybe more countries would be in famine now if we were not there. We have 10 countries right off the top that have 1 million people that would be in famine if, in fact, things deteriorate, and we don't have the funds, or if the supply chain breaks down. So this is what's an incredible dynamic here. You know, when World War II hit, the supply chain worldwide did not break down. You had supply chain breakdown in the war zones, but unlike then, now the supply chain is breaking down around the world, and this is creating havoc in many places, price spiking, the movement of foods, the movement of supplies, economic deterioration. And so it is really a disastrous situation. So we've got to get the economies rolling. We've got to thread that needle and resolve and fix both of these issues at the same time. Otherwise, as I think Tony Blair said, the cure is going to be worse than the disease.
Right. You and other UN agencies have just issued a new appeal for $4.7 billion in funding. This is in addition to an earlier call for $2 billion. But when you look at the economies of powerful, rich Western countries in Europe, in the US, they're into a big recession. How are they going to give money for humanitarian aid when they need to tend to their own people?
Mark, this is a very good question. In fact, I was in Washington, D.C. in the last 3 days meeting with United States leaders. And first, you don't want to shoot the goose that lays the golden egg. They've got to revitalize their own economy so we can keep receiving the support that we receive from the nations around the world that are productive and successful and have the monies. And so I understand that. However, having said that, every leader that I've been talking to in the last few weeks they clearly understand the need of food security, because if you don't have food security, you'll have destabilization, mass migration, war, and conflict, and the cost will be so much more. And so what we're doing is analyzing out the hot spots where we see there'll be deterioration that will implicate disaster in not just the African region or in the Middle East, but also have national security interests in European nations and nations around the world. So what I've been hearing from leaders in Europe and in the United States is that we're not backing down. We're going to do what we can to help. And so I'm very hopeful, but at the same time, the numbers are not small, Mark. They're big. And also, I'm asking the world's billionaires who still continue to make money, it's time for you to step up in a way you've never stepped up before. People are in need, and it is not, this is a one-time phenomenon, and we need your help, and we need it.
Right, because, I mean, you talk about the Trump administration. Obviously, the U.S. is the largest donor to your agency, but we just learned that 20 million jobs were destroyed in the U.S. within the month of April alone. So how can Donald Trump turn and say, well, I'm going to give money to the World Food Program?
Well, fortunately, President Trump, the State Department, and this is what's been incredible, because you know, as you watch the news, you've got Democrats and Republicans in Washington, D.C. fighting on everything.
Yes.
But when it comes to international foreign aid and food security, and I mean, literally in the last few days, I have talked with several of the key Democrat and Republican senators. They come together on food security and international aid. And in fact, we're talking about a substantial increase in funding because of the crisis. But there's a lot of politics to walk this through. When I've sat down with President Trump or Pompeo, they clearly understand the impact that destabilization will have on Europe and the world and the United States. So they get it. They're committed to working with us, and I do believe they'll come through. But it's a mammoth task. And let me say this, Mark, because even if we have the money, and I'm very concerned about that, and I'm very concerned about the people losing their jobs, because then you've got remittances. We're looking at about 20% of global remittances, and that's about $500 billion, literally falling away from those people poor in countries like Ethiopia, Lebanon, Syria, etc. But put the money aside. If the supply chain breaks down and you can't get food into the marketplace, you can't get food to the beneficiaries, the people that are struggling to eat, that are starving, then you're going to have famines unlike anything we've ever seen before. And that's what we're very concerned about, because if you have border restrictions, ports closing down, farmers can't get to the market, it's a bad situation, and we've got to act, and we got to act quickly.
Right. On Africa, clearly you're seeing those things, but up until now, the virus has not hit as much as it's done in China, in Western Europe, and of course in the U.S. Do you think, as some others have been saying in the UN or outside the UN, that the worst is still to come, or that maybe there in Africa there's better protection and there was earlier action, or do you think the worst is still ahead for them?
Mark, I would like to think it's going to be different, but quite frankly, I think it's going to be catastrophic. I think the worst is yet to come. I think it's going to be terrible. We're doing the analysis now. We're already just give you an example. In Syria alone, we'll come to Africa, we're already seeing a spike in additional 2 million people because of breakdown of supply chain and economic deterioration. We take, for example, Ethiopia. 50% of their export is tourism. Well, that's gone. 98% of the export revenues for South Sudan is oil. Oil has crashed. Nigeria, 90%. And so I can go from country to country and show you what's already happening. This is before COVID is taking this exponential, impact in terms of disease spreading throughout Africa. And so we're working with the leaders, making certain that we minimize the lockdown, the shutdowns and the lockdowns, all these types of things, so that we can keep the supply chain going. If that supply chain breaks down, it will be catastrophic. You're already seeing some protests and riots in certain select cities now around the world, and especially in Africa, Nairobi. And so we're asking the leaders, if you do a shutdown, block an area, we've got to have a safety net program inside because people can't get food. And if young people lose their jobs and can't get food for their families, you're going to have destabilization.
Right. Just very quickly, a more personal question. You contracted COVID a few weeks ago. How are you doing, and how was this experience?
Well, young people just go through it like it's nothing. I'm a little older, and it didn't hit me so bad, but it lingered with me for about 3 weeks. I had a little fever, a little aches and pains, but not bad. It just lingered. But I'm over it now, 100%. Hopefully, I got the immunity. I'm acting like I do anyway, and so I'm all hands on deck now. And let me say this. When most organizations have to leave countries during times of war, conflict, emergency, like Ebola, that's when the World Food Program really goes in hard. 97% of our people are putting their lives on the line, doing what they need to do to save lives, because that's what we do best. If we get the money, get the access, supply chain doesn't break down, we will save millions of lives and avert famine in countries all over the world, Mark.
David Beasley, thank you very much for being with us on the France 24 interview from South Carolina, and thank you for watching it here on France 24.
France 24 es rigurosidad, precisión y responsabilidad. Somos una familia comprometida con el periodismo y la verdad.
C'est une des seules chaînes d'infos où on nous laisse jouer en plateau avec des Legos, avec des robots, avec tout un tas d'objets.
We take a return ticket to revisit some of the key people and places of the last 50 years of world television news.
على فرانس 24 يمكننا أن نحاور أصحاب القرار من العالم في كل الميادين ولدينا المساحة لكشف ثنايا مسيرتهم.
Aquí en France 24 tenemos a varias personas de distintos países, algo que es un reflejo de cómo es Latinoamérica, con culturas muy distintas. Y allí es muy bonito encontrar que en el deporte todos tenemos algo en común.
Les femmes, elles sont souvent victimes de l'actualité internationale, mais ce sont aussi des actrices majeures de la géopolitique. Et d'ailleurs, on en parle dans France 24.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.